extracted from the private records of Evelyn Carter, Midwife. Lynchburg, Virginia, autumn, 1892. My name is Evelyn Marie Carter, and I have been a midwife in this county for near 17 years. I write this account not for glory nor vindication, but so that truth might outlive those who would bury it. What I discovered in the autumn of 1892 still haunts my sleep, though the bobbies themselves were beautiful, unnaturally so. I lived then in a modest room above the apothecary on Main Street, where the widow Mrs. Dalton kept boarders who paid their rent on time and caused no trouble. My days were spent attending births throughout the county, from the poorest sharecropper's cabin to the wealthiest estate. I was known as steady-handed and discreet, qualities essential for a black woman in such work. My companion in those years was Thomas Reed, a freedman who worked the livery stable and dreamed of saving enough to buy land westward. We had spoken quietly of marriage, though we told no one yet. The Belmont estate sat 3 miles north of town, a sprawling tobacco plantation that had survived the war by adapting its cruelties to new legal forms. Master Richard Belmont owned it still, a man of 50-some years with silver hair and a voice like silk over iron. He employed nearly 40 souls, sharecroppers, house staff, field workers, all bound to him through debt or necessity. The house itself was a white monument to old wealth, with columns that caught the morning light and cast long shadows across the workers' cabins behind. I was called there often, for the estate had many young women of childbearing age. Master Belmont insisted on my services specifically, paying well and on time, which I could not afford to refuse. His housekeeper, a severe white woman named Mrs. Pritchard, would meet me at the servants' entrance and escort me to whichever cabin required my attention. There were rules at Belmont Estate: speak only when addressed, enter through the back, never linger near the main house after dark, keep your eyes on your work. I followed them carefully, as did Thomas when he occasionally drove me there in the borrowed cart. It was late September when I first noticed the pattern. I had been summoned to attend a young woman named Clara, who labored in a cabin near the tobacco sheds. She was perhaps 19, her skin the warm brown of creek clay, her hands calloused from field work. The birth was difficult but successful, and when the child finally came, I cleaned him and wrapped him gently before placing him in Clara's exhausted arms. The baby had emerald eyes. Not the cloudy blue that sometimes darkens with age, but a clear, striking green that caught the lamplight like colored glass. And his hair, what little fuzz crowned his small head, was pale blonde, nearly white. Clara saw my expression and looked away quickly. "He healthy," she whispered. "Yes," I assured her, though my mind turned like a mill wheel. "Strong and healthy." Mrs. Pritchard entered then, her face impassive. She glanced at the child without comment, then handed Clara a small bundle of cloth and a jar of salve. "Master Belmont will see the child is provided for," she said coolly. "You will resume light duties in 1 week." I gathered my instruments in silence, but my chest felt tight. Over the following months, I was called back to Belmont Estate 4 more times. Each birth was the same: a young black woman, laboring alone or with only another worker for comfort, bringing forth a child with emerald eyes and hair like winter wheat. The mothers never met my gaze when I asked gentle questions. The bobbies were always taken to the main house within days, and the mothers returned to their work with hollow expressions and empty arms. Thomas noticed my troubled silence one evening as we sat on the boarding house porch. "You carry something heavy," he said quietly. I wanted to tell him, but fear sealed my lips, fear of what I could not yet name. It was in December, on the shortest day of the year, that I attended my 6th such birth. The mother was a girl named Grace, barely 16, who wept silently through her labor. When the child came, another green-eyed, blonde infant, she turned her face to the wall. Mrs. Pritchard collected the baby without a word, but as she passed me, I saw something in her expression crack, just for a moment. Not compassion, but something closer to resignation or perhaps complicity. That night I could not sleep. I lit my lamp and began to keep a record, writing down dates, names, and details I had been trained to observe. 6 births, 6 mothers, 6 children with the same unmistakable features. All from one father. I did not yet know how deep the rot went, nor how dangerous the knowing would become. But I had begun to document what others wished forgotten, and that small act of defiance would change everything. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. Before we continue, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time right now. We're deeply interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented stories that time tried to erase reach. January 1893. The new year brought ice that made the roads treacherous and the births more urgent. I was called to Belmont Estate on a bitter January morning when the sky hung low and gray as old pewter. Another young woman, Naomi was her name, had gone into labor prematurely, and Mrs. Pritchard's message carried a tone of unusual urgency. Thomas drove me in the livery's wagon, the wheels crunching over frozen mud. He had grown quieter in recent weeks, sensing the shadow that followed me home from that place. "You don't have to keep going there," he said as we approached the estate gates. "I do," I replied, though my stomach nodded. "They pay and she needs me." What I did not say was that I had become compelled to witness, to document, to remember when others were forced to forget. Naomi's labor was swift and brutal. She was so young, her body hardly ready for such an ordeal, and she screamed until her voice broke into whispers. I worked as fast as I dared, my hands steady even as my heart raced. When the child finally came, I saw immediately that he was small, too small, his skin translucent and his breathing shallow. But his eyes, when they fluttered open, were that same impossible green. I wrapped him carefully and tried to warm him, but Naomi turned her face away, tears sliding silently down her temples. "Don't let me see him," she whispered. "Please don't let me see." I had attended many births where mothers grieved or struggled, but this was different. This was not the exhaustion of labor or the fear of poverty. This was shame, deep and corrosive, shame that had been placed upon her like a brand. Mrs. Pritchard entered and assessed the situation with cold efficiency. "The child will not survive," she said flatly. "See to the mother's recovery. Master Belmont will be informed." I wanted to object, to fight for that small life, but Mrs. Pritchard's eyes held a warning sharp as any blade. I bit my tongue and did as instructed, though the baby's weak cries echoed in my ears long after he fell silent. When I finished, Mrs. Pritchard gestured for me to follow her into the hallway. The cabin felt suffocating, the air thick with things unspoken. Outside, she handed me my payment, more than usual, and then she spoke in a low, clipped voice. "You are a skilled midwife, Evelyn, skilled and discreet. Master Belmont values discretion above all else." She paused, her pale eyes fixed on mine. "I trust you understand that what occurs on this estate is private business. Gossip is unbecoming and dangerous." The threat was clear, wrapped in polite language like a knife in velvet. "I understand," I said carefully, though my hands trembled as I folded the bills. She smiled thinly. "Good, we would hate to lose your services. There are few midwives of your quality." As Thomas drove me back to town, I stared at the frozen fields and felt something harden inside me. That night, I added Naomi's name to my hidden ledger, along with the date and the child's brief existence. 7 mothers now, 7 children. I began to ask quiet questions. I spoke to Clara when I saw her at the market, but her eyes went wide with fear and she hurried away. I tried to visit Grace under the pretense of a follow-up examination, but was turned away at the estate gates by a field overseer who said she was no longer in residence. Where had she gone? Where had her child gone? The questions multiplied like shadows, but answers remained scarce. It was Thomas who finally gave voice to what I had not dared to name. We sat together in the small church where we sometimes met on Sunday evenings, the pews empty and the candles burning low. He had been unusually tense, his jaw tight. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "you know what's happening out there, don't you?" I looked at my hands. "I suspect." "It's him," Thomas said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Master Belmont, he's forcing himself on those women, those children, they're his." Hearing it spoken aloud made my chest constrict. I nodded slowly. "Then you have to stop going there," he urged, taking my hands. "If he thinks you know, if he thinks you might speak." "I can't abandon them," I interrupted. "Those women have no one else, and if I stop going, who will witness? Who will remember?" Thomas closed his eyes, his grip tightening on my fingers. "I'm afraid for you." "I'm afraid too," I admitted. That night, lying awake in my narrow bed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a sound like wind, but there was no wind. It was a sound like weeping, but there was no one near. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the floorboards, from the very air. I rose and looked out my window toward the dark silhouette of Belmont Estate in the distance, and I understood then that I was no longer simply a midwife. I had become a keeper of evidence. And evidence, in the hands of a black woman in Virginia, was the most dangerous thing one could possess. March 1893. Spring came reluctantly that year, the ground slow to thaw and the dogwoods late to bloom. I continued my work throughout the county, but Belmont Estate had become a place of dread in my mind, a wound that would not heal. I was called there twice more in March. Both times the pattern held: young black women, isolated in the workers' cabins, bringing forth children with features that could not be denied. The mother's eyes had begun to haunt me. They held a particular emptiness, as if something vital had been extracted along with their children. Mrs. Pritchard grew more watchful. She began to linger during my visits, observing my work with an expression that suggested calculation rather than concern. Once, I caught her reading over my shoulder as I made notes in my medical journal, only routine observations, nothing incriminating, but her scrutiny made my hand shake. The whispers had begun in town as well, though they were carefully veiled. At the market, women would fall silent when I approached, then resume their conversations in lower tones. At church, I noticed sidelong glances, conversations cut short. Someone had started talking, though I did not know who. It was during this time that I met Ruth Williams. She appeared at my boarding house door on a gray afternoon, a woman perhaps 10 years my senior with silver threading through her dark hair and eyes that had seen much. She introduced herself as a former worker at Belmont Estate, now employed as a cook for a family in town. "May I speak with you privately?" she asked, her voice steady but quiet. We sat in my small room, the door closed. Ruth folded her hands in her lap and spoke without preamble. "I know what you've been seeing out there," she said. "I know because I lived it. 15 years ago, I bore a child with green eyes and blonde hair. Master Belmont's child, though such a thing could never be spoken aloud. They took my baby girl when she was 3 days old, told me she'd been placed with a good Christian family up north. I never saw her again." My throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Ruth said firmly. "Be careful. Belmont has been doing this for decades. There are others, women who left the estate, women who disappeared, women who died in childbirth under suspicious circumstances. He has power, Evelyn. The sheriff is his cousin. The judge owes him money. The minister at First Baptist takes his donations and asks no questions." "How many?" I whispered. "I don't know, 20, 30, more." Ruth's voice cracked slightly. "He chooses the young ones, the ones with no family to protect them, the ones who can't afford to leave. And when they bear his children, he takes them. Sometimes he keeps them as servants in the main house, raising them as orphans or distant relations. Sometimes they disappear entirely. I felt sick, and no one stops him. Who would? Ruth asked bitterly. The mothers have no standing to complain. The children belong to him legally if anyone bothered to check papers, which they don't. And anyone who speaks against him finds their employment gone, their housing revoked, their reputation destroyed. Or worse. Worse. Ruth met my eyes. 3 years ago, a field worker named Joseph tried to protect his sister when Belmont took an interest in her. Joseph was found dead in the tobacco barn. They said it was an accident. It wasn't. A chill ran down my spine. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you're keeping records, Ruth said simply. I saw you writing in your ledger, and I saw the way you look at those bobbies. You're documenting what happened, aren't you? I hesitated, then nodded. Good, Ruth said. Someone needs to, but you need to be smarter about it. Don't keep your records where they can be found. Don't speak of this to anyone you can't trust completely. And for God's sake, don't let Belmont or Mrs. Pritchard suspect what you know. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. This was my daughter's. I kept it for her, thinking she might return someday. I want you to have it. Hide your real records inside it or use it as you see fit. But keep bearing witness, Evelyn. We need someone who will remember. I took the book, my hands trembling. What happened to the others who tried to speak? Ruth's expression darkened. They learned to be silent, or they left, or they vanished. After she departed, I sat alone in the gathering dusk and examined the book she had given me. It was a child's diary, the pages mostly blank. On the first page, in careful script, was written, "Property of Margaret, born March 12, 1878. Margaret, Ruth's daughter, a green-eyed child lost to history." That night, I transferred my careful notes into the diary, writing in the margins and blank spaces, coding names and dates in ways that might escape casual notice. I hid the book beneath a loose floorboard under my bed. Thomas came by the next evening, and I told him everything Ruth had shared. His face grew darker with each revelation. "We need to go to the authorities," he said. Ruth said the authorities are compromised. Then we go to Richmond, to the newspapers, someone who isn't in Belmont's pocket. And if they don't believe us, if they punish the women for speaking, if Belmont retaliates, I shook my head. We need more than stories, Thomas. We need proof that can't be denied. What kind of proof? I thought of the ledger hidden beneath my floor, the names and dates, the pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Birth records, legal documents, maybe even the children themselves if we could find where they've been placed. It was a dangerous thought, and we both knew it. Over the following weeks, I began to notice other things. Strange sounds at night, footsteps that stopped outside my door, then retreated. A sense of being watched when I walked to the market. Once, I returned to my room to find my belongings subtly disturbed, as if someone had searched them carefully. Mrs. Pritchard's scrutiny intensified. She began asking pointed questions. Did I discuss my work with others? Did I keep detailed records? Had anyone made inquiries about the estate? I lied smoothly, my face calm, but my pulse raced. Then came the incident that changed everything. I was called to Belmont Estate on a rainy April evening. Another birth, another young mother. But when I arrived, Mrs. Pritchard met me at the door with an expression I had not seen before, something almost like fear. "The mother is hemorrhaging," she said curtly. "Come quickly." I ran to the cabin and found a scene of horror. The young woman, her name was Anna, lay in a spreading pool of blood, her face gray, her breathing shallow. I worked frantically, doing everything I knew, but the bleeding would not stop. Anna died just after midnight, her hand going limp in mine. The baby survived, another green-eyed boy. Mrs. Pritchard stood in the doorway, watching. "You will record this as a natural complication of childbirth," she said coldly. "Nothing more." She needed a hospital, I said, my voice shaking. She needed to be more careful, Mrs. Pritchard interrupted. These things happen. You will write it as such. I looked at Anna's still face, at the baby crying weakly in the corner, and I understood that I had just witnessed murder by neglect. That night I wrote everything in the hidden diary with shaking hands. Anna's name, the date, the circumstances, the truth. And I knew that my time for silence was ending. May 1893. Anna's death haunted me like a ghost that would not rest. I had attended difficult births before, had lost mothers and bobbies despite my best efforts, but this was different. Anna had been denied the care that might have saved her because her suffering was inconvenient, because her life was deemed expendable. I reported the death to the county clerk as required, recording it as death by childbirth complications. The lie tasted like ashes in my mouth. Thomas saw the change in me immediately. "You can't carry this alone," he said as we sat in the small cemetery behind the colored church, where Anna had been buried in an unmarked grave. "This weight will break you." "What choice do I have?" I asked. "If I speak, I endanger everyone. If I stay silent, I become complicit in his crimes." "Then we gather proof first," Thomas said quietly, "real evidence, and then we take it somewhere it can't be ignored." But gathering evidence proved more dangerous than we anticipated. It was late May when I received a summons to Master Beaumont's office, not to attend a birth, but to meet with him directly. The request came through Mrs. Pritchard, delivered in her usual cold manner, but I detected something new in her eyes. Not quite warning, but close. Thomas insisted on accompanying me to the estate gates, though he could come no further. "If you're not back in 2 hours, I'm getting help," he said, his jaw set. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. The main house was as imposing inside as out. I was led through hallways lined with portraits of Beaumont ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow my progress. Mrs. Pritchard showed me into a wood-paneled study where Master Beaumont sat behind a massive desk, a glass of amber liquid at his elbow. He was handsome in the way that powerful men often are, the kind of handsomeness that comes from good breeding, fine clothes, and the confidence of never being done. His emerald eyes, so distinctive in his children's faces, regarded me with calm appraisal. "Evelyn Carter," he said, his voice smooth, "please sit." I sat in the chair across from him, keeping my back straight, my hands folded in my lap. Every instinct screamed danger. "You've been providing services to my estate for over a year now," he began conversationally. "Mrs. Pritchard tells me you're quite skilled, reliable, discreet." "I try to be, sir," I said carefully. "Discretion is a valuable quality," he continued, swirling his drink, "particularly in delicate matters. I'm sure you've observed that my workers sometimes find themselves in unfortunate circumstances." He was testing me, I realized, probing to see what I would say. "I attend to medical matters only, sir," I replied evenly. "I don't concern myself with other affairs." "Good, very good." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. "However, I've become aware of certain rumors circulating in town, whispers about the children born on this estate, unfounded gossip that could damage reputations, mine, the mother's, even yours." My heart hammered, but I kept my face neutral. "I wouldn't know about such rumors, sir." "No," his eyes narrowed slightly. "Because I've been told that you keep very detailed records of your work, medical notes, observations. Is that true?" "Standard practice for any midwife, sir," I said. "Birth weights, times, complications, nothing unusual." "I'd like to see these records," he said pleasantly, "just to ensure everything is in order, for your protection as much as mine." The request hung in the air like a blade. If I refused, it would confirm his suspicions. If I complied, he would see the truth I had been documenting. "My records are medical documents, sir," I said slowly. "They contain private information about the women I attend. It wouldn't be proper to share them without good cause. Beaumont's pleasant expression hardened. I'm giving you good cause, Ovlun. As the employer of these women, I have every right to review any medical documentation related to them. With respect, sir, I believe such matters fall under physician-patient confidence. I could consult with the county medical board to clarify. The county medical board, he laughed, a cold sound. You're not a physician, girl, you're a midwife, a colored midwife at that. You have no rights they're bound to respect, and you know it. The mask had slipped, revealing the contempt beneath. I held his gaze, though my hands trembled in my lap. I know what I am, sir. I also know my work is honest and thorough. If you have concerns about my competence, I understand if you wish to employ someone else. It was a gamble, calling his bluff, offering to walk away. For a long moment he said nothing, and I wondered if I had miscalculated. Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That won't be necessary. Your work is satisfactory, but I want to be clear, Ovlun. This estate operates under certain understandings. Everyone who works here who benefits from the employment I provide maintains those understandings. Am I clear? Yes, sir, I whispered. Good, because if I were to discover that someone was spreading lies, making false accusations, or interfering with the proper order of things, he paused, letting the threat hang unspoken. Well, such a person would find life very difficult. Employment would dry up. Housing would become scarce. Accidents might happen. Do you understand what I'm saying? I understand, sir. Excellent, he stood, signaling the meeting was over. Mrs. Pruchard will see you out, and Ovlun, I trust this will be the last conversation we need to have on this subject. Mrs. Pruchard appeared to escort me through the house, her face unreadable. At the door she leaned close and whispered, You should have shown him the records. Now he knows you're hiding something. The spring air felt like a prison as I walked toward the gates where Thomas waited. My legs shook, and I had to pause twice to steady myself. Thomas took one look at my face and pulled me into his arms. What happened? He knows I suspect, I said against his shoulder. He as much as admitted what he's doing but cloaked it in threats. If I speak, if I act, he'll destroy me, or worse. Then we leave, Thomas said urgently. Tonight, we go west like we planned, start over somewhere he can't reach. I pulled back, meeting his eyes. And abandon those women. Leave them to bear his children and lose them, one after another, with no one to even remember their names. You can't save them by dying, Thomas said desperately. No, I agreed, but I can save them by living long enough to expose the truth. That night I lay awake and understood that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. Beaumont knew I was documenting his crimes. He had warned me to stop, and I had silently refused. The question now was not whether he would act against me, but when. And I realized, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that I would rather die bearing witness than live in complicit silence. The rain began just before dawn, drumming against my window like fingers seeking entrance. In the sound, I heard the voices of all those mothers, all those lost children, asking to be remembered. I would not fail them, whatever the cost. June 1893. The summer heat arrived suddenly, as if nature itself had grown impatient. The air hung thick and still, and tempers frayed like old rope. I continued my work with careful precision, attending births throughout the county while avoiding Beaumont Estate whenever possible. Mrs. Pruchard sent for me twice, but I claimed prior commitments, sending another midwife in my stead. It was a temporary reprieve, and we both knew it. Thomas had begun making inquiries, carefully, quietly, about legal remedies. He spoke with a colored lawyer in Richmond who specialized in civil rights cases, a man named Mr. Augustus Freeman. The news was not encouraging. He says testimony from the mothers would be needed, Thomas reported as we met in the back room of the livery stable where he worked. But most would be too afraid to speak, and even if they did, A white man's word would outweigh theirs in any Virginia courtroom. What about the children themselves? I asked. Physical evidence of paternity. Virginia law doesn't recognize such claims from enslaved or indentured workers, Thomas said bitterly. And technically, these women are free. They can't be legally enslaved anymore. But their debts to Beaumont keep them bound just as surely. They have no legal standing to make paternity claims. We sat in defeated silence until Thomas added, Mr. Freeman did say that if we could document a pattern of coercion, especially if combined with other crimes like Anna's death, we might build a case for criminal prosecution. But we'd need multiple witnesses willing to testify, detailed records, and a prosecutor willing to take on a powerful white landowner. Which means we need to find the other women, I said. The ones who left the estate, the ones who survived. Ruth Williams became our silent partner in this effort. Through her connections in the colored community, church networks, domestic workers, laundresses who heard everything, she began identifying women who had borne Belmont's children and lived to tell of it. The search took weeks and revealed horrors I had not imagined. We found Mary Johnson working as a seamstress in Richmond. She had left Belmont Estate 8 years prior after bearing twins with emerald eyes. The Bobbies had been taken from her at birth, and she never learned what became of them. She agreed to speak with us but refused to testify publicly. "He'll find me," she whispered, her hands shaking. "He has people everywhere. I have a new life now. I can't risk it." We found Sarah Green in a sanatorium outside Petersburg, her mind broken by grief and laudanum. She had borne 3 children to Belmont over 5 years. When she finally tried to refuse him, she was beaten so severely she could never bear children again. She could barely remember her own name. We found the graves of 2 women who had died in childbirth under suspicious circumstances, their deaths recorded but never investigated. And we found the children, some of them, in the servants' quarters of Belmont's main house. Under the pretense of delivering medical supplies to Mrs. Pritchard, I glimpsed them. 5 children ranging in age from infancy to perhaps 8 years old, all with those distinctive green eyes and blonde hair. They were dressed as servants' children, referred to as orphans taken in by Master Belmont's Christian charity. They were being raised by the man who had fathered them, erased from their mothers' lives, their true origins buried beneath lies. I documented everything in the hidden diary, my handwriting growing smaller and more cramped as I tried to fit all the terrible evidence onto its pages. Names, dates, locations, testimonies from women too frightened to speak aloud but willing to whisper truth in safe spaces. It was Ruth who discovered the key, the old ledger that would make everything irrefutable. She appeared at my door one evening in early July, her expression tense with suppressed excitement. "I found something," she said. "Or rather, someone found it for me." She told me of a former estate manager who had worked for Belmont's father and stayed on for the son's early years. The man, now elderly and dying, had kept records of estate expenses including payments made to women for damages and relocations. Hush money, essentially, paid to mothers to ensure their silence and departure. "He kept the ledger as insurance," Ruth explained, "in case Belmont ever turned on him. He's dying now, consumed by guilt and wants the truth known before he goes, but he's afraid to come forward himself." "Will he let us see the ledger?" I asked, my heart racing. "Better, he'll give it to us, but we have to go tonight before his courage fails." Thomas, Ruth, and I made the journey to a small farmhouse 15 miles outside of town where the old manager lay dying. His name was Harold Webb, and he looked like a withered branch, his skin paper-thin, his breathing labored. But his eyes were clear. "I kept silent for 30 years, he whispered as he handed me a leather-bound ledger. "I told myself it wasn't my business, that I needed the employment, but silence is its own kind of sin. These records show payments to 17 women between 1868 and 1885. Some were enslaved when they bore his children. Others were free. It made no difference to him. I opened the ledger with trembling hands. There in neat columns were names, dates, amounts paid, and notations for discretion regarding child, for relocation expenses, for medical care following complications. It was evidence written in Belmont's own hand, or at least in his father's, showing a pattern that stretched back decades, proving this was not isolated crimes but systematic exploitation. "Why now?" Thomas asked quietly. "Why give this up now?" Harold Webb coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Because I'm dying and I can't meet my maker carrying this burden, and because Anna," his voice broke. "Anna was my granddaughter. Her grandmother was one of the women in that ledger. When I heard she died in childbirth on that estate, I knew history was repeating and I couldn't bear it anymore." The old man died 3 days later. We attended his burial in the colored cemetery, and I placed wildflowers on his grave, grateful for his last act of courage. Now we had testimony from survivors. We had my medical records. We had the old ledger proving a decades-long pattern. We had everything except the most important thing, a prosecutor willing to act. Mr. Freeman advised us to approach the federal authorities rather than local courts. "There may be violations of the 13th Amendment if we can prove involuntary servitude through debt bondage combined with sexual coercion," he explained. "It's a difficult case, but not impossible." We began preparing our formal complaint, gathering every piece of documentation, every witness statement we had collected. Ruth worked tirelessly, her determination fueled by the daughter she had lost. Thomas used his savings to pay for Mr. Freeman's time and for the journey we would need to make to Richmond. And I continued attending births, waiting for the inevitable summons back to Belmont Estate. It came in mid-July, delivered by Mrs. Pritchard herself, who appeared at the boarding house with a message written in Belmont's elegant script. "Your services are required. Come at once. A difficult case." I knew it was a trap. Belmont had surely heard whispers of our investigation. This was his response, a summons I could not refuse without abandoning a woman in labor, but one that would place me directly in his power. Thomas begged me not to go. "Let someone else attend, you've done enough." "If I don't go, he'll know I'm afraid," I said. "He'll know we're moving against him. We need more time to prepare the federal case." "And if you go, he might kill you," Thomas said bluntly. I looked at the man I loved, at his honest face lined with worry, and I made my choice. "Then I go prepared, and if something happens to me, you take everything we've gathered to Mr. Freeman. You see this through." That night, I wrote a letter documenting everything we had discovered, sealed it, and gave it to Ruth with instructions to deliver it to the federal prosecutor if I did not return. Then I hid the diary and the old ledger in a metal box and buried it beneath the apple tree behind the boarding house, marking the spot with 3 stones arranged in a triangle. In the morning, I walked into Belmont Estate knowing I might not walk out. But I walked in bearing the truth, and that made me dangerous. And Master Richard Belmont was about to discover just how dangerous a woman with nothing left to lose could be. Late July, 1893. The woman in labor was named Della, and she was barely 17 years old. She had been at the estate only 6 months, arriving after her parents died and leaving her orphaned with debts she could not pay. Mrs. Pritchard had offered her employment, room, and board in exchange for work. Della had thought it a blessing. She knew better now. The labor was progressing poorly. The child was positioned wrong, and Della was exhausted from 12 hours of fruitless contractions. I worked by lamplight in the stifling cabin, trying to turn the baby, my hands slick with sweat and blood. Della gripped my arm with desperate strength, her eyes pleading. "Don't let me die like Anna," she whispered. "Please." "I won't," I promised, though I knew such promises were fragile things. Mrs. Pritchard watched from the doorway, her presence oppressive. I wanted to demand she leave, To insist this was no place for observers, but I held my tongue and focused on my work. After another hour, I managed to turn the child. The delivery was swift after that, and when the baby emerged, a girl this time, wailing and healthy, I felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought tears. The baby had emerald eyes. Della looked at her daughter and began to weep, not tears of joy but tears of grief and rage and helplessness. "They'll take her from me," she sobbed, "just like the others." "Rest now," I said gently, though my heart broke. "You need your strength." Mrs. Pritchard stepped forward to take the baby, but I held firm. "She needs to nurse first," I said, "for her health." "Master Belmont prefers." "The child's health comes first," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "Or would you prefer to explain to Master Belmont why his daughter died of neglect in the first hours of life?" It was the first time I had spoken the truth aloud in that place, naming Belmont as the father, acknowledging what everyone knew but no one said. Mrs. Pritchard's face went white, then red. "You overstep," she hissed. "I speak medical fact," I replied evenly. "The child needs to nurse, immediately." We stared at each other across that small cabin, the baby wailing between us, and I saw something shift in Mrs. Pritchard's expression. Not quite respect, but perhaps recognition that I would no longer pretend. She stepped back. "1 hour," she said coldly. "Then I take the child to the main house." When she left, Della clutched the baby to her chest. "What do I do?" she whispered desperately. "I can't lose her, I can't." I knelt beside the bed, my mind racing. "Listen to me carefully. In 3 days there will be a church gathering in town for the summer revival. Go, tell the minister you need sanctuary. There are people who will help you leave this place. My debts are manufactured to keep you enslaved in all but name," I said fiercely. "You owe nothing to a man who has taken everything from you." Della looked at me with desperate hope. "You'll help me." "I'm helping all of you," I said, "but you have to be brave. Can you do that?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I left Belmont Estate that evening with a new resolve burning in my chest. The time for silence had ended. The time for careful documentation was passing. Now came the time for action. Thomas met me at the gates, his face tense with relief when he saw me emerge unharmed. "What happened?" "War," I said simply. "We're at war now, whether we wanted it or not." Over the next 48 hours, events accelerated beyond our control. Ruth's network sprang into action. Word spread through the colored community that Della needed help escaping the estate. A safe house was arranged. A cart was prepared for the journey north. Money was collected to pay off her supposed debts, should anyone question her departure. But Belmont moved faster. On the second evening after the birth, Della disappeared. Not fled, disappeared. Mrs. Pritchard claimed she had stolen items from the house and run off in the night, abandoning her baby. A search was organized. The sheriff, Belmont's cousin, led it personally. Thomas and I knew better. We knew Della had been taken, removed before she could speak, before she could reach the safety we had promised her. "We can't wait any longer," Mr. Freeman said when we met with him urgently in Richmond. "If she's been harmed, if Belmont has silenced her permanently, we need to act now before more women are hurt." He had prepared the federal complaint, documenting the pattern of sexual coercion, involuntary servitude through debt bondage, and suspicious deaths. The old ledger was our primary evidence, supplemented by my medical records and the testimony of the women who had agreed to speak. It wasn't perfect, it might not succeed, but it was truth, documented and undeniable. Mr. Freeman filed the complaint with the federal prosecutor's office on the morning of August 1st. By afternoon, federal marshals were dispatched to Lynchburg to investigate. And Master Richard Belmont learned that someone had finally challenged his power. The response was swift and vicious. That evening, the livery stable where Thomas worked caught fire. The blaze consumed 3 buildings before it could be controlled. Thomas escaped with minor burns, but the stable owner, who had been sympathetic to our cause, lost everything. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who oppose me. The next day, Mrs. Dalton informed me that my boarding house room was needed for another tenant. I would need to vacate within the week. When I protested, she looked at me with pity and fear. "I'm sorry, Evelyn, but I can't afford to anger certain people. I'm sure you understand." I understood perfectly. Belmont was systematically destroying the lives of everyone associated with me, demonstrating his power, punishing resistance. Ruth lost her position as well, dismissed without explanation or severance. But Belmont made a critical error in his campaign of intimidation. He underestimated our resolve and overestimated his invulnerability. The federal marshals arrived on August 5th. They interviewed workers at the estate. They examined birth records at the county courthouse. They spoke with the surviving women we had identified. And they found Della. She was being held in a locked room in the estate's cellar, Mrs. Pritchard claimed, for her own protection after her alleged theft. But Della told a different story, of being dragged there the night she had planned to flee, of threats made, of the baby being torn from her arms. The marshals also found something else, a room in the main house containing 5 children, all between infancy and 8 years old, all with identical emerald eyes and blonde hair. When questioned about their parentage, Mrs. Pritchard claimed they were orphans. The children themselves, when gently questioned, revealed confusion about who their mothers were. Several had been told their mothers were dead, though we knew this to be false. Belmont refused to answer questions without his attorney present, but his silence spoke volumes. On August 7th, formal charges were filed. Involuntary servitude, sexual coercion under color of debt bondage, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy to conceal felonies. The town erupted. The white community largely rallied to Belmont's defense, claiming persecution and overreach. The colored community watched with held breath, hopping but not quite believing that justice might finally come. I moved my belongings to Ruth's small house, where we waited together for the storm to break fully. Thomas came each evening, his hands still bandaged from the fire, his eyes fierce with determination. "We did it," he said. "We really did it. We got the truth out there." "The truth is out," I agreed, "but the battle has just begun." That night, as rain lashed against Ruth's windows, I retrieved the diary from its hiding place and wrote the latest entries. The story was no longer mine alone to tell. It belonged to all the women who had suffered, all the children who had been stolen, all those who had been silenced. And now, finally, their voices would be heard. Whatever came next, we had spoken truth to power. And power, for once, would have to answer. August 1893. The trial began in the oppressive heat of mid-August, held in the federal courthouse in Richmond, to avoid the taint of local influence. The courtroom was packed each day, white citizens in their finest clothes occupying the front rows, colored citizens relegated to the back and balcony, reporters from as far as Washington and Philadelphia filling the press gallery. I had never seen so many people hungry for a story. Master Richard Belmont arrived each morning in a fine carriage, dressed impeccably, his face a mask of affronted dignity. His attorney, a silver-haired man named Thaddeus Crane, was renowned for defending wealthy clients against accusations of impropriety. Together, they projected an image of respectable Southern gentility under assault by carpetbagger justice. But Mr. Freeman was prepared. He had spent weeks marshaling evidence, preparing witnesses, and crafting a case that would be impossible to dismiss. The prosecution began with the ledger. Harold Webb's meticulous records were entered into evidence, each entry read aloud to the court. Payment to Charity M for discretion regarding child, $20. Payment to Rebecca S for relocation, $50. Payment to Sarah G for medical expenses following complications, $30. 17 women, 17 documented payments, a pattern spanning 20 years. These are not charitable donations, Mr. Freeman argued. These are hush payments, compensation for silence regarding children fathered by Richard Belmont upon women under his economic control, women who could not refuse his advances without losing their livelihoods, their homes, their very survival. Attorney Crane objected repeatedly, claiming the ledger proved nothing except Belmont's Christian generosity toward unfortunate women. My client has long provided support for workers who found themselves in difficult circumstances, he said smoothly. To twist charity into accusation is unconscionable. But the ledger was only the beginning. Next came my medical records, carefully documented birth dates, descriptions, and the unmistakable pattern of physical features. I took the stand on the third day, my hands steady as I held the diary I had kept hidden for so long. These are births I attended at Belmont Estate over 18 months, I testified. 8 children, all bearing identical physical characteristics, emerald green eyes and pale blonde hair. I have attended over 300 births in my career. Never have I seen such a consistent pattern of unusual features, except in cases of shared paternity. Crane rose to cross-examine me with barely concealed contempt. Miss Carter, you are a midwife, not a physician. Are you qualified to make determinations about paternity based on appearance? I am qualified to recognize patterns, sir, I replied evenly, and to document what I observe. These features could be coincidence. Green eyes and fair hair do appear in colored populations. Not 8 times in 18 months in a single location, sir. Not with this exact shade of green, identical to Master Beaumont's eyes. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Crane's face reddened. You're making inflammatory suggestions based on circumstantial observation. I'm presenting medical facts, sir. The court may draw its own conclusions. Thomas testified next, describing the systematic intimidation we had faced, the fire, the evictions, the threats. Ruth Williams followed, her voice shaking but determined as she told the story of her own daughter, taken 20 years ago, her voice breaking when she identified one of the children in Beaumont's household as possibly being her lost girl, now grown and working as a servant. But the most devastating testimony came from the women themselves. Della went first, still weak from childbirth, her hands trembling as she swore her oath. In a quiet voice that nevertheless carried to every corner of the courtroom, she described arriving at the estate in debt, being assigned to work in the main house, and then being summoned to Beaumont's study one evening. He told me my debts could be forgiven, she said, staring at her hands. If I was kind to him, I didn't understand at first. When I did, I tried to leave. He said if I left, I'd be arrested for theft and fraud. He said no one would believe me. He said I had nowhere to go. What happened next? Mr. Freeman asked gently. He forced himself on me, Della whispered. That night and many nights after, when I became with child, Mrs. Pritchard moved me to the workers' cabins. After the baby came, they tried to take her. When I resisted, they locked me in the cellar. Crane's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested Della was a willing participant seeking financial gain. He implied she was lying for attention. He questioned her moral character and her intelligence. Della endured it all, her voice never rising above a whisper but never breaking either. He hurt me, sir, she said finally, meeting Crane's eyes. He hurt me and many others. That's the truth, whether you believe it or not. Mary Johnson testified next, then 2 others who had come forward after hearing about the trial. Each told similar stories: economic desperation, isolation, coercion, violation, stolen children. The most shattering moment came when one of the children from Beaumont's household was brought to the stand. She was perhaps 7 years old, with those distinctive emerald eyes, dressed in a neat servant's uniform. Mr. Freeman approached her gently. Can you tell the court your name? "Mugrat," she said softly. Ruth Williams gasped aloud from the gallery, then began to weep. Her daughter, the child taken from her arms 20 years ago, still bearing the name Ruth had given her. "Who is your mother, Mugrat?" Mr. Freeman asked. The child looked confused. "Mrs. Pritchard says my mother died. I work in the house." "And who is your father?" "Master Beaumont takes care of me. He says I should be grateful." The child was excused, but the damage to Beaumont's defense was catastrophic. Even the most skeptical observers could not deny the evidence of their own eyes. A child bearing Beaumont's unmistakable features, raised as a servant in his household, separated from her mother who sat weeping in the gallery. Beaumont finally took the stand on the 8th day of trial, his composure beginning to crack. He denied everything. The payments were charity, the children were orphans, the women were lying for money. His attorney had prepared him well. But Mr. Freeman was relentless. "Mr. Beaumont, you have emerald green eyes, do you not?" "I do." "And blonde hair, though now graying." "Yes." "How do you explain that 8 children in your household, claimed as orphans from various sources, all share these exact distinctive features?" "Coincidence, providence. I cannot account for God's design." "Can you name the families these orphans came from?" Beaumont hesitated. "Some came from agencies, others were found in difficult circumstances." "You have no documentation of their origins." "The records are incomplete." "Incomplete or non-existent," Mr. Freeman's voice rose. "Because I suggest to you, sir, that these children are not orphans at all. They are your children, born to women under your economic control, taken from their mothers and raised as servants in your home. I suggest that you have perpetrated a system of sexual exploitation lasting decades, using debt bondage to create conditions tantamount to slavery, violating the 13th Amendment and the basic human dignity of every woman under your power." "That's a damned lie," Beaumont shouted, his mask finally cracking. "Those women came to me willingly. They understood the arrangement. I provided for them and their bastards better than they had any right to expect." The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered for order. Crane tried to retract the statement, but it was too late. Beaumont had confessed. Not in legal terms, perhaps, but in the court of public opinion and moral judgment, he had revealed his true nature. The children were his. The women had been under his control. He considered it his right. The trial concluded the following day. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts. Beaumont's face went gray. Crane began immediately preparing appeals. But in that moment, standing in the federal courthouse with the weight of law finally on the side of truth, I felt something shift in the world. Justice was imperfect, delayed, and incomplete, but it had come. Thomas found me in the corridor afterward, Ruth beside him, all of us weeping. "You did it," he said, holding me close. "You actually did it." "We did it," I corrected, "all of us together." That night I wrote the final entries in the diary, my hand cramping from the weight of all those words, all those documented truths. Master Richard Beaumont was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His estate was placed under federal receivership, the workers' debts nullified, the women freed from bondage. The children, all 9 that were found, were placed in the care of their mothers where possible, or in supervised foster arrangements where reunion was not feasible. Ruth was reunited with Mugrat, who slowly, painfully, began to remember a mother she had been taught to forget. And I continued my work as a midwife, but now with a new purpose, documenting not just births, but the truth of women's lives in a world that preferred their silence. The story spread beyond Virginia, carried by newspapers and reformers, becoming ammunition in the fight against systems of exploitation that persisted despite emancipation. We had won this battle. Others remained. But we had proven that even the most powerful men could be held accountable when the truth was told loudly enough, when evidence was preserved, when the silenced finally spoke. And that was something no courtroom verdict could diminish. Concluded from the records of Evelyn Carter. October 1893 and beyond. The autumn came quietly that year, the leaves turning gold and scarlet as if the earth itself was celebrating transformation. The verdict had been delivered, but the work of rebuilding lives had only just begun. Della took her baby daughter and traveled north to Philadelphia, where Ruth had connections with a church community that welcomed her without judgment. Before she left, she came to say goodbye, her eyes still haunted, but now also holding something that resembled hope. "I'm naming her Evelyn," she said, holding the child out to me. "After you, so she'll always know that someone fought for her, even when the world said we weren't worth fighting for." I held that green-eyed baby and wept, not from sorrow, but from gratitude that she would grow up knowing her mother's love, instead of being raised as another man's property. The other mothers slowly emerged from hiding or silence, reclaiming children where possible, mourning those who had been lost to adoption or death, or the vast machinery of erasure. Ruth and Margaret began the difficult process of becoming family again, Margaret gradually learning to call her mother instead of ma'am. Thomas and I were married in November in a small ceremony at the colored church, surrounded by the community that had sustained us through the darkest days. Mr. Freeman attended, as did many of the women whose stories had become part of the trial record. We spoke our vows under a simple wooden cross, promising to honor truth and each other in equal measure. We moved west the following spring, settling in a small Oklahoma town where land was available to black homesteaders and the past felt less suffocating. I continued my work as a midwife, but I also became something else: a documenter, a chronicler, a keeper of stories that others wished forgotten. The diary I had kept, along with the old ledger and all the evidence we had gathered, was donated to the Frederick Douglass Memorial Library in Washington, where it was cataloged as part of the archive of African American testimony. I had hoped it would be studied, referenced, remembered. But history, I learned, is selective in its memory. The Belmont case briefly captured national attention, then faded from public consciousness as other crises emerged. Richard Belmont died in prison in 1898 of pneumonia and was buried in the family plot with full honors, his crimes largely forgotten by the white community that had once revered him. Mrs. Pritchard disappeared after the trial, her complicity documented but never formally prosecuted. Some said she moved to Charleston. Others claimed she took a position managing another estate under a different name. I hope she carried the weight of what she had enabled into whatever future she found. The estate itself was eventually sold, subdivided, and transformed into farmland. The main house burned down in 1902 under mysterious circumstances. No one was injured, but I sometimes wonder if one of the mothers returned to ensure that monument to suffering would not stand. The children scattered across the country, some keeping their distinctive features, others disappearing into the broader streams of American life. I heard, years later, that one became a teacher, another a railroad worker, a third a seamstress known for her fine needlework. They survived. They lived. They were more than the circumstances of their conception. Ruth lived to be 76, passing peacefully in her sleep with Margaret holding her hand. Before she died, she told me that recovering her daughter had healed something she thought permanently broken. "I got to be her mother again," she said. "Even if only for a little while, that's enough." Mr. Freeman continued his legal work, taking on dozens of similar cases across the South, winning some, losing many, but always fighting. He wrote to me occasionally, updating me on the slow, frustrating progress of civil rights law. "Justice is not a destination," he wrote once. "It's a direction we must choose repeatedly, even when the path is obscured." As for me, I delivered over 800 bobbies in my lifetime, attended to thousands of women, and kept careful records of every birth. But it was the births I documented at Belmont Estate, those 8 children in 18 months, that I returned to most often in memory. They were the beginning of my understanding that bearing witness is itself a form of resistance, that documentation is a weapon against erasure, that the truth, even when uncomfortable, even when dangerous, must be preserved for those who come after. I am writing these final words in the winter of 1928. I am 64 years old, my hands knotted with arthritis, my eyes weakening. Thomas passed 2 years ago, peacefully, loved and honored in our community. I miss him daily. I have gathered all my records, all the testimonies I collected, all the evidence of truths that powerful men wished buried, and I am donating them to the National Negro Archives with instructions that they be preserved for future researchers. Perhaps someday, when this nation is ready to confront its full history, someone will read these accounts and understand what we endured, what we fought, what we survived. The bobbies with emerald eyes and blonde hair are grown now, scattered across the country, some aware of their origins, others perhaps mercifully ignorant. But they exist. They are living proof of crimes that occurred, suffering that was inflicted, and justice that was, however imperfectly, served. I am often asked if I regret the choices I made, the documentation, the confrontation, the risks taken. I do not. Yes, I lost much: employment, housing, safety, peace of mind. But I gained something more valuable: the knowledge that I chose truth over comfort, courage over complicity. And I helped ensure that those women and children were not forgotten, their lives not erased, their suffering not rendered invisible by the convenient amnesia of history. This is my testimony. This is the record I leave behind. May it outlive those who would bury it. May it serve as evidence for future reckonings. May it remind those who come after that even in the darkest times, even against the most powerful opposition, truth-telling matters. The mothers' names are recorded here. The children's births are documented. The crimes are detailed. The victims are remembered. And that, perhaps, is the truest victory we could claim. Evelyn Marie Carter Reed, Midwife and Witness. Final entry, January 7, 1928.